Okay, already.
Hello, I'm Melissa Shapared. I'm a technical architect, and I'm here to share with you today my solution for Global Adventure Tours. So first, a bit about the company. Global Adventure Tours is a company that specializes in booking and organizing adventure-based tours. They're an organization that matches adventure seekers with boutique tour operators and guides across the world. They operate in different geographies, such as Australia, Asia, Europe, Africa, Middle East, North America, and Latin America. They work with 500 different tour operators worldwide and anticipate over 300,000 adventurers within the first year. Some of the project goals and requirements are to consolidate onto a single Salesforce org. We'll go through an evaluation of which current org most closely aligns with the global standardized processes and the config that supports our desired future state. Addition of Service Cloud into the selected org. And then due to rapid growth, Global Adventure Tours would like to use Salesforce and other technology to automate and enhance their processes. We'll also implement a scalable and flexible API-led integration approach and a platform architecture to support future growth via acquisition. We're going to retire the current tour management system, which is currently end of life and no longer supported by its vendor, and we'll take a phased MVP approach by region, starting with the US first. Some risks and assumptions are that an existing sales org has similar processes to the desired global processes. Payment Force can support hosted payments using HTTPS. There are multiple local currencies that need to be supported. Payment Force can support an HTTP-based REST API. Service Pro supports REST, and some user volumes are estimated. Some of the risks are we need to migrate data from multiple systems. So there's a reliance on SIs and independent contractors. Change the Payment Force need to go through rigorous testing, and each region is currently has distinct business processes, and there's frictions and escalations on the US being the priority. There's also a history of bad deliverables, and major changes to its application are restricted to only once a quarter. Some of the strategies we'll use are, like I mentioned, we'll use a single org strategy. So we're going to unify their global processes, which is part of the project to desire to standardize processes, which is easier to achieve when consolidating into a single org. I mentioned we'll reuse an existing org with similar processes and configurations. So we'll build on top of that to get to the end state, which will reduce the scope of work and faster time to market. It will also create less data to migrate and a shorter cutover time. It's a lower risk for adoption since some of the users are already using the org and are familiar with Salesforce, and they can also help train other users. It will give us a 360-degree view of the customer, easier for collaboration. It'll be less complex integration architecture, and it will support a global service team. Also, I didn't see any data residency requirements or complex compliance requirements. We'll support this through page layouts, record types, sales and support processes with pick lists and visual flows. This will create a more complex security model. We'll have to control visibility of records using record types or visibility of record types and fields through profiles and permission sets. We'll use principle of least privilege for data access and no WD. You can have delegated admins per region and one super admin to oversee the org. And we'll have governance for differing processes and try to maximize reuse of code and existing declare functionality. We'll have oversight by the architecture review board and change review board, standards defined by the Center of Excellence. Some considerations for starting with multi-org and go into a single org that we need to define future state and consolidate a data model. Determine which org is most similar and be the surviving org, migrate metadata from the retiring orgs, use a tool such as Flowsum, and then use ETL to migrate data from the retiring orgs. Some other strategies are multi-language, multi-currency. So because it's global with multiple regions, they said that they need their sites, pages, and correspondence to be in the local language of the user. We'll use Translation Workbench, export community navigation and re-import as translated navigation items. We'll have a language selection in the experience site for users, and we can use Visualforce email templates, which are less complex than multiple Lightning templates. We'll also enable multiple currency, which can be set on the record. For identity for our internal users, we'll set up Okta with AD. We'll have an SSO configuration for that, and we'll sync users between Okta and AD using our ETL. For external, we'll use Okta with LDAP. We'll have another SSO configuration that's for the tour operators. For the adventurers, it mentions they can use Facebook, Twitter, or Google Plus. We'll have 3 auth providers with reg handlers for each of those external authentication providers. For mobile, the internal will use Salesforce One, external will use Mobile Publisher. I considered custom and native apps, but didn't see requirements such as full offline capabilities, pixel perfect UI, and this will be faster time to market and lower total cost of ownership. For document management, we use files. We've got about 1,000 gigabytes of storage based on my estimated numbers for user licenses, and we also can archive files to S3 buckets when we archive our data. For reporting, I'm suggesting Tableau CRM, that we can also make use of some standard reports where there's not advanced analytics. And then some add-ons or digital engagement for chat, flows from permitted data, migration, DocuSign, DocChain, and e-signature for some document templates that we need to create, and then Autosaver for backup and restore. This is where I did some files and data calculations to get my 1,000 gigabytes of file storage based on the number of Salesforce licenses that I estimated. And next are the actors and licenses. So we have tour operator coordinators. They'll have a sales cloud license. They'll need CRM functionality, and they'll manage the tour operators. Adventure specialists, they'll also have a sales cloud license. They'll have CRM functionality and access to tour proposals. There are service coordinators. They'll be working in the service cloud, so they'll be dealing with cases, digital engagement with chat, and also omni-channel. They'll be assigned cases via omni-channel. There's also the regional managers. They'll oversee the adventure specialists and the tour operator coordinators. And then we have, for external users, we have tour operator office managers. I'm going to give them Customer Community Plus because they'll need to manage tours and schedules, create schedules. They'll have delegated admin and also reporting access. Then there's tour operator staff. They'll just be Customer Community. They just need access to the experience site. Then the local tour guides, which will provide support through chatter groups, and also there's some advanced sharing, so they'll get Customer Community Plus. And then the adventure seekers will just be Customer Community, and they'll just be booking and paying for their tours on the website. The role hierarchy I've identified our CEO, then our regional VP, and then regional managers. Tour operator coordinators will report to them, and then tour operator managers and tour guides, since they are Customer Community Plus, will be reporting to the tour operator coordinators. And then we have the adventure specialists, and then since we have global service, we'll just have a global service director and the service coordinators. And next is our system landscape. So we have Salesforce with an experience site, which both the guides and adventurers will use because they'll need to work with each other. And then we have a separate experience site for the tour operators. Have the auth providers using OpenID Connect for authentication with Salesforce. Then we also have the mobile apps using User Agent and OpenID Connect. That's the Salesforce mobile publisher app. And then Salesforce One will be using User Agent with SAML. As I mentioned, we're going to use Okta for IDP. So this will provide a SP-initiated we'll provide SP-initiated deep linking. We can use the relay state for to directing them back to the correct SSO configuration. We'll have to import the IDP certificate. We'll have multiple SSO settings, as I mentioned, one for internal, one for external. And this is also to provide auto provisioning and deprovisioning of users. Okta can connect to both LDAP and AD. That's why I made my decision to use Okta. It's got LDAP and AD agents that sit behind the firewall, connecting through specific ports. Then there's also a current on-service in-house payment gateway, payment force. So I'm suggesting we use an HTTPS URL redirect for the users to make their payments. And then we also can communicate on the back end, making the assumption that there's a REST API there. We'll also need to retire the regional sales orgs and just keep the surviving sales orgs. So we'll be using the ETL tool to bring data in using the bulk API. And we're going to use the ETL for our large data loads, archival, extract, transform, load of data. The ESB will be more for our real-time event-driven architecture. It can provide automatic retries, error handling, and orchestration for us. Also protocol conversion for things such as OData. And then it provides a decoupled, scalable, and flexible integration architecture. The ESB will be connecting with Salesforce through a Salesforce connector using Comet D and the Bayou protocol for the streaming API. So we'll call the REST API to make call-ins, also connect to event channels for the streaming API, and can expose data for us using OData. It also will be securing the ESB with Salesforce using a token Veriflow, and also enforce mutual authentication on the Salesforce side. And the same with the ETL, we'll use the same security there as well. And then we also have a tour management system, which we are retiring. So it's got an EDI interface. So we'll have to connect to that to pull the data using ETL, and I'll get more into the data migration later. This is the data model that I'm suggesting. So we have accounts and contacts. We have operator accounts, but then I'm suggesting we have person accounts for the adventurers. Orders will be the tour bookings that the adventurers place on the experience site. And this will have a look up to the tour schedule that they're interested in, which looks up to the tour that the tour operators are going to be operating. Cases can be logged against the tour booking for the adventurers when they come up with any issues or need any help. And then there'll be an integration with Service Pro for the cases as well, if any dispatch of an on-site crew member is needed. Also, we have applications for tour operators to operate and facilitate tours through Global Adventure Tours. And then we also have the tour guides that get assigned to the different tours. So that will be assigned to the tour guide booking. And then we have some external objects for archiving our data. So the thing here that's going to be the biggest LDV object is our order. And we'll want to archive also the schedule and the tour that it's associated with. And I'll go into this a little bit more later as well. The object volumes, I calculated the tour booking as being the largest here. And so we'll get into the LDV. So the impacts LDV has are on CRUD operations. They slow down. It also has an impact on overall system performance, also has impact on read operations such as searches, list views, reports, and page load times. It also can cause issues with CPU timeouts, and sharing calculations can slow down and cause record locking. Also, I'm suggesting that we just have a system owner for the orders to help the owner not be in the role hierarchy to prevent locking from sharing calculations. We can use the query plan tool, which will help us optimize our queries. We want to make use of standard index fields such as order number, order name, start date, and the lookup to the account for any reporting or list views and for any SOQL queries. If we don't find that those indexes are enough, we can ask Salesforce to create custom indexes, but keep in mind that the threshold for the custom index is lower than the standard index. For long term, we want to archive our data to the data warehouse when the tour dates are complete, along with the tour schedule and the tour header record, and then bring that data in as an external object. Next, we'll get into some business processes. So the first is the tour operator management. So the tour operators will express their interest to operate with Global Adventure. So there'll be an online application. We just can have a visual flow and a guest community page for them to go in and enter the information. And then this application will be assigned to a tour operator coordinator based on region on a round robin basis. So we can implement round robin queue assignment logic and have a queue for the tour operator coordinators. And then once the tour operator coordinator selects the application to work on, they also need to capture supporting documentation. So it mentions that these documents are about less than 10 megabytes in size. So this is well under the limit of 2 gigabytes for our files. So we can just upload these as attachments on the application. And then they need to be able to collaborate with each other on these requests. So we can just have them do manual sharing on the application to anyone else that needs to collaborate, and they can collaborate over chatter. They also need to come up with a registration score and take in some other information. So to automate this process a bit, we can create a visual flow with different steps that they need to take for the registration of the tour operators with custom fields to capture the inputs. We also need to have the adventure specialist needs to be notified to perform local visits. So we can assign this to a queue for the regional adventure specialists. And this will be done by omnichannel skills-based routing, and this supports custom objects. So since the application is a custom object, this is supported. There also needs to be an email sent to the tour operator to request a visit. So they can just send an email from the application record using the Visualforce email template, and they can create an event for the on-site visit on the application record. And then once they are on site, they need to be able to approve or cancel the registration via mobile apps. So this is where they use Salesforce Mobile, and they'll want to make sure to cache their records for access before they go on site in case they lose connectivity. And we can give them a quick action to either approve or cancel the application record. There's also some scoring that has to be done, and then it will need to be submitted to the regional manager for approval. This will just be an out-of-the-box approval process. And then once the tour operator is onboarded, we're going to have a custom conversion to create the account and contact upon approval. And then they'll also be onboarded to the experience site where they'll get a login email with the login, and they'll set their password with Okta. Also, the system needs to create a letter in their local language. We can have a record trigger flow with a translated Visualforce email template, and the tour operator coordinator will be the account owner. The next step is an integration with the payment for system. So once they are onboarded, Salesforce will have to will fire a platform event, which will be a fire and forget pattern to payment force through the ESB. So this can be an asynchronous process because we don't need an immediate response for the user. We'll create the tour operator account and payment force so they can be set up as a vendor. And then the ESB will return using a remote call-in to update the tour operator account with a creditor ID. The next is the tour proposal and scheduling. So this is after the tour operators are onboarded, they'll go in and create proposed tours. So they'll log into the experience site, create a new tour that's in a draft status. I did consider using products and price books here, but the tour pricing is really set by the tour operator, not by Global Adventure Tours. They're just charging a fee for their services to connect them with the adventurers. So also there's some relationships that need to be built between the objects, and a product can't be a child in a master detail relationship. And I do have the master detail relationship here between tour and tour schedule. Also, the tour operator can specify maximum capacity and a 12-month schedule. So the maximum capacity will be a custom field in the tour, and the tour schedule will be determined by the child tour object. So there'll be multiple schedules per tour. Also, the tour, so it mentions that the adventure specialist can review these proposed tours, and then they want a user-friendly method for the tour guides to review and update the status for multiple tour requests. So I'm assuming here that the tour guide then gets assigned to the tour schedule by the adventure specialist. So they'll find any available tour guides and then assign them to the tour schedule. So we'll have a sharing set with a lookup field on the tour schedule for the tour guide, so they'll be able to view those records. They can just view those in a list view in the experience site. And then the proposed system should automatically check that the guides are not double booked. So we can just we could create a flow for the scheduling of the tour guides and call invocable Apex from the flow to check to see if there's any guides that are already booked for those dates and times. It'll be some custom logic. And then they want to create a pre-formatted PDF document. This will be used DocuSign to create the PDF and attach it to the score with the scheduled dates. And then once the review is complete, then the creditor's account is debited in payment force. So this is an amount that is set regionally. So also consider products here, but it seems like it's very straightforward. So we can just have these values in a custom metadata type. So when the payment needs to be made, that amount can be retrieved from the custom metadata type depending on the region. And then there'll be another integration here for Salesforce to send that request to payment force to deduct the tour operator's account. And then if the account is successfully debited, the tour is published automatically. If not, an email notification is sent to the tour operator. So this is when the tour status will be changed to status of published, and the tour cost will be associated with that specific tour schedule that the tour operator sets. So there's also a process of the tours being renewed. So we can have a checkbox on the tour for it to be a renewal tour. So each year it will auto create them. So there's another integration process here that happens. So the ESB would query Salesforce via remote call-in through the REST API. It will have a scheduled job to check daily for any tour renewals. If there are any, it will send a request to payment force to debit the tour operator's account and receive back a request or failure. That would be a remote process invocation request and reply between ESB and the payment force. And then once the ESB receives the status back, it will call Salesforce. So if it's with a remote call-in through the REST API. So if it's successful, the ESB will update the tour status to renewed, and then there'll be a record trigger flow to copy the old tour dates to new dates, and then also send an update to the tour operator system. But if it's not successful, the ESB will have to update the tour status to something such as need review, and there'll be a record trigger flow to send an email notification to whoever needs to be notified of the failure. Then there's the adventurer request. This is where the adventurers will log into the community and check all the published tours. They can also use their mobile device to do this. So they'll be using mobile publisher or the experience site. You can build a Lightning Web Component with an Apex controller without sharing to do a custom search on all the different tours and the tour schedules. So they can get the information on the tours for which one they would like to create their booking for. And then the search will display where the tours are. So we can use Google Maps with the Lightning Web Component and bring that in through an iframe. And we'll have the tour location coordinates on the tour record, which you can plot on the map. The adventurer also needs to They also would like to be suggested tours that they might like based on types and number of tours that they've booked in the past 5 years. So this is going to take some logic with some of the historical data that gets archived. So we can use a Lightning Web Component and use Apex without sharing to query the external objects and perform logic for those suggestions. And then the adventurer can then make their booking. So then they have to pay for their booking. So this is where we can use a URL redirect over HTTPS. I'm assuming that Payment4 supports a hosted payment page for the customers. So the payment request will send URL parameters to the hosted page with the things such as customer ID, payment amount, or receive back a payment transaction or failure. And then the payment transaction can be stored on the order number. And then the system should prevent bookings if the capacity for the scheduled tour is exceeded. So each time an order is placed against a tour booking or tour schedule, the current count on the tour schedule get updated. And then when the limit that's defined on the tour, or even at the tour schedule level is reached, the status will be set to close, and then it will filter to not show any tours that are in closed status to be booked against. And then also tour operators can make bookings in their own system. This is something I didn't mention. So I'm proposing an external API gateway for the tour operator systems to communicate with Salesforce. And they can create bookings in their own system, which get sent to Salesforce. So we've used some sort of HTTPS OAuth authentication there. And then ESB will have to make a remote call into Salesforce to update the total count in the tour schedule. And then I make an assumption here that we're going to get that total count back to the tour operator system. So we would do that through the ESB, which would be a remote process authentication from the ESB to the tour operator system. And then it mentions that if the adventurer had booked a high-risk tour and they have a medical condition, this will require them to electronically sign a waiver acknowledging the risk, so that we can use DocuSign Doc and e-signature to send that request to them for their signature. The last part is the adventurer support. So once the adventurer has signed up for a tour, they can post questions to get responses from the public. So and they can also post photos and make comments against the tours for others to view. So we'd have different chatter groups in the experience sites for the different tours, and this is where the tour guides will also need to collaborate with the adventurers. So that's why we would have put them both in the same community in the same experience site. Also, the adventurers might get into trouble and request assistance via their mobile device. So this is where they use the mobile publisher app. They would create a case, and then the case would be assigned to a specific queue per region for the different service coordinators. So and we can set up case assignment rules based on their case request type, because it mentions that it will be also based on the nature of the request. So within those different regions, we could have different service coordinators that work on different types of cases. And then there'll be email assignment on the case. There'll be a case link in the email once the email is sent upon assignment. Next, there'll be a process to notify the regional managers if the request is not accepted within 1 day. So we can create a case escalation rule based on the case creation date. And then there's different priority for different cases. So we can create reminders for these specific types of cases. And then there's different SLAs. So for the case response time, so the SLA can be based on a field on the account for the adventurer. And then updates to the request then need to be integrated to the field dispatch system, which I'm assuming is Service Pro. So here we have an integration where Salesforce creates a platform event. This is a fire and forget pattern, once again, going through the ESB. And I'm assuming we can use asynchronous here because it mentions real time. I'm assuming near real time is going to be sufficient enough. So when the case is created that requires a dispatch, we'll send that request to the Service Pro system. And then they mentioned that the adventurers need to be able to chat with service coordinators who specialize in different types of requests, so that we can use digital engagement with chat. We can use a pre-chat form to determine what kind of requests they're creating. And then also we can make use of omni-channel skills-based routing. So first the request we get assigned to a queue, and then the queue would be associated with the routing configuration, which would then use skills-based routing to determine what service coordinator would be eligible to work on that case. They calculate the number of assistance requests that are at the fault of the tour operator. So we're going to have to track this at the tour operator account level each time the case is determined to be their fault. We'll have to increase that number so we can have a checkbox on the case where they determine that it's based on the tour operator's fault. And then we can update the account via record trigger flow, and then we can set the risk level on the account using a formula field depending on that number. And then they also want to track feedback and performance of the service coordinators. So we can use a case close auto response rule with a survey. We'll have to have surveys enabled for that. Next, we'll get into some some data migration. So this is something I wanted to go over is the data and files archival. So when we do archive our data to the data warehouse, we're going to want to archive any associated files as well. So we'll use the bulk API 2.0 to move the data out using our ETL, and then the REST API for moving out our files. And then we'll move the data to an AWS data warehouse, and then files to AWS S3 buckets where we can set the folder name to match the record ID for the data that the files are being archived for. And then once we verify everything's there, we're going to want to come back in using the ETL, using the bulk API, and hard delete those files and data. So we're going to want to archive the orders, which are the tour bookings, maybe about 60 days after they are complete. And then we want to archive the tour as well as the tour schedule, but we only want to delete the tour if it's not a renewal. If it is a renewal, we'll just be creating a copy and then leave it in Salesforce for future tour dates. The files will be extracted from our content version and content document link, and then we'll come back in and delete the content document, which will delete all the content versions. This is the data migration that I'm proposing. So we have the tour management system where we'll have to migrate data such as accounts, contacts, tours, schedules, and the bookings. And then we also it mentioned that there's spreadsheets as well. So we'll want to bring the data in from both the tour management system and the spreadsheets. And also we're going to be bringing in data from the other Salesforce service orgs. There'll be accounts, contacts, tours, and schedules there as well, and bookings. And all this data will be brought into a staging database. We'll want to do some cleansing, deduping, standardize, and enriching of our data there. We can match duplicates based on some criteria such as first name, last name, zip code, phone, or email. We'll want to work with the data architect to determine what that criteria is. And then we'll want to map and transform that data to the Salesforce object schema in a canonical database. And we'll also work with the data architect there as well. We can match the children to their parents using their external ID, and we'll want to go through a specific order of load due to dependencies with the record dependencies. So we'll want to load our tours first, and then our tour schedules, and then accounts, contacts. Actually, we'll want to load accounts first because the tours will be associated with accounts, and then contacts, and then tour schedules, and then bookings. And then we'll use our ETL to bring the data into a data warehouse. So any historical or inactive data from these source systems will just go straight to the data warehouse. Any operational or active data will go to the different Salesforce sandboxes for testing and validation. And then all of the data will go to prod once we're ready for cutover, where we'll do a smoke test and validation of the data. And we'll want to turn off automations and validations, email alerts, anything like that, especially since we're going into our existing org. And we'll want to take an iterative approach. So we'll do an initial data load within a migration window, and we'll do delta loads after that within smaller migration windows. And there's some governance around these timelines that we're going to have to consider. Next is some accessibility requirements. So it mentions that they want to ensure a seamless SSO between the service coordinators in Salesforce and Service Pro. So we can set up Salesforce as an IDP for Service Pro, which will be the SP. Also, customers should be able to register and sign on using Facebook, Twitter, Google. Went over that. So this is where we'll set up a custom self-reg page so the customers can register themselves, and then they can decide to use any authentication provider for their credentials. So we'd actually want to register them up first, and then we can use the existing user linking so they can link their, we can create a button with that existing user linking URL for the auth provider so they can link their existing social credentials to the account we create up front. And also they don't want them to have to re-enter their credentials on the mobile app. So this will just be the connected app for the mobile app, and the refresh token is valid until revoked. We can also set up biometric ID app unlock on the mobile publisher app so that they don't have to enter their password. And then tour operator coordinators can view and edit registration requests, and tour operators that have been created for the regions. There'll also be role hierarchy and ownership-based sharing. Tour operators are only able to manage draft tours and schedules that they're responsible for. And then tour operators have the office manager who can view data and all the staff for their organization. So there'll be a tour operator lookup on the tour. We'll have a sharing set where the user account equals the tour operator. And the office manager will be a delegated admin. Draft tours and their schedules are only visible to the AS by adventure specialists by region. And then published tours and their schedules are visible to all users. So we can have criteria-based sharing, or sharing role with a regional role that we'll share to. And when the published tour can also be a criteria-based sharing rule, we share with the CEO and subordinates. That's when it will become available to the entire role hierarchy. Also, internal users can view all adventures in their tour booking. So we'll have criteria-based sharing with account where the account type equals a person account. And then also another criteria-based sharing rule with the CEO and subordinates here. And then the orders are viewable because they're controlled by parent. And something we do want to take into consideration is the number of criteria-based sharing rules. We'll have 50 per object. So if we do feel like that's going to be an issue, we'll have to look at alternatives. And then it mentions the tour operator coordinator can view and edit the number of fatalities and injuries for a tour operator. This would be field level security, custom fields on accounts that they'll have visibility to. And then the adventure specialist can view all the tour registration requests in their region that require follow-up, except for those that are high risk. And then only adventure specialists trained to manage high risks can view them. So there'll be ownership-based sharing based on a regional role, but criteria-based sharing for high risk, which we'll share with a public group per region for those ASs trained to manage those types of cases. And then adventurers can only view their own contact information, tour bookings, and assistance requests. So this is their experience site access. They'll get default access for their contact. The orders will be controlled by parent on their account. And then we'll have a case sharing set where the user contact equals the case contact. Tour guides can only view the details for operators for 6 months prior to the scheduled tour. So this is where I'm suggesting we need to use some advanced sharing for the tour guides because we'll have to have some Apex sharing and some scheduled batch Apex. So we'll open these up to them 6 months prior to the scheduled tour. And then service SCs and their managers should only be able to view the adventure assistance requests assigned to them. So this will just be role hierarchy by ownership of the case and sharing to their managers through the hierarchy. Some reporting requirements. Adventurers need to be able to view a history of their travel for the past 2 years. So this will be a Lightning Web component with Apex without sharing to query both the current platform data and the external object to bring it together in one view. The tour operator coordinators need a dashboard and reports of travel schedules for the past 2 years. We can give them Tableau CRM because it will connect to multiple data sources, including the data warehouse for the archive tours and schedules. The tour operators can require a report of their upcoming tours and schedules and bookings. So this will just be a list view for their tours and schedules and then sharing set on the order for the tour operator lookup. And then office managers of the tour operators require a report of their staff's draft tours and schedules. They'll have Customer Community Plus and delegated admin, and they can run a report and see all data for their account. And then the Global Adventure Tour Management requires a dashboard showing a summary of travel booking trends for the past 7 years. So they can use Tableau CRM for the historical trending and multiple data sources. That's not data that we'd even want to have on Salesforce, and it is for quite a while. So they'll be needing to report on the archive data in the data warehouse. Next, we'll get into some other requirements. So it mentions that they run in their IT runs in 2 divisions. They have internal facing employee and external facing. They're headed by the respective CIO. And there's a shared services group which supports both security and the PMO office. So I'm suggesting that our CIO is our executive sponsor here. We'll also have a steering committee with representatives from different parts of the business for governance body. And then within our COE, we'll have a program owner to oversee all the different parts of the project. We'll also want to have compliance and data privacy because we'll have to be taking into consideration things like CCPA. And then when we move in to setting this up for other countries, things such as GDPR. So we'll also have a technical part of the governance body, which will be comprised of the architecture review board, technical architects, solution architects, data architects. We'll also have release management to oversee the release cycles. We'll have data management to oversee all of the things such as data stewardship and work with the data architects. And then we'll have QA for testing. And then security and InfoSec, which it mentions they have security and PMO, so we're going to bring them into this governance body. The PMO will be on the business side. So on the business side, we have the business analyst, we have change review that will help review any changes coming into the project. We'll also have change management. It will oversee adoption, training, and communication, and this is where our PMO office will be. And we have our different project work streams that we're going to set up, such as the Salesforce platform development, mobile, which will mostly be for testing, integration, and then we have data. We also have payment force and anything that needs to be done with Service Pro. I am suggesting a hybrid project management structure such as Agile, which is Agile and Waterfall combined. We can do some Agile development for the platform within some more defined release cycles, because there are some, it mentions that there's some there's only changes that can be made once a quarter. So and only severity 1 and severity 2 defects are allowed as exceptions. So we're going to really need to align to these dates in the more waterfall style of project management, and then we can operate more agile within these set dates. So that's where we're going to have to use the hybrid approach. And then there's separate teams for managing critical fixes versus new development. So we don't want our teams to be so separated, because we do want the people doing the fixes, to understand the development that's been done. So I'm proposing that we bring them more together, and that they'd all be part of the things such as daily stand-ups and in grooming sessions for Agile. Also, because payment force is a critical system that needs to go through rigorous testing. It mentions it can take multiple weeks, so more of a waterfall approach for any changes of payment force, and we're really going to need to align to those dates as well. And then we'll have to have strong QA support for the testing, and we'll have to align to all the testing cycles for QA as well for payment force. They also mentioned that they've had varying outages, and they have standard SLAs for all business functions. So this is where I'm proposing we use a backup and restore tool such as Otisava. It can help us operate even if Salesforce goes offline, using our backups, and also it will protect us during our data migrations. So we are going to be working with an existing org, so we will want to back up all of our data in case something goes wrong in that data migration. It will also just adhere to the SLAs. So that's how Salesforce will be part of that process. It also mentions there's hiring restrictions that have been there in the past. So that's why they bring in individual contractors and system integrators. So there's a lot of churn of resources. It's led to high risk and bad deliverables. So we want to implement a more formal DevOps strategy. So this is where we can use a Git repo for source-driven development. It can version our code and help developers to not overwrite each other, and help teams work a little bit more seamlessly together. They'll want to use some tools such as VS Code for standardization, and they can use SFDX plugins. We can also have them using PMD, which we can set up rules for code quality, as well as ESLint for Lightning Web Components. And then Apex unit testing and just testing can be done by the developers, and also they can use mocks and stubs for testing against any integration endpoints that aren't ready, and then SonarQube for static code analysis. So the developers would want to be going through a daily commit process, and then when they're ready for their code to be reviewed, they'll be working on a feature branch though, which will be branch from develop. So then once they're ready for their code to be reviewed, they'll submit a pull request, and then that code will be reviewed by someone else on the team. They can check to see if the code is meeting the business requirements and if it's adhering to standards. And then once it's verified, that code can be merged into the develop branch, which would kick off a job to then push it through the Jenkins CI/CD pipelines to the different environments for different testing. If the build does fail, notification can be sent to the developers to fix any of the issues that cause the build to break. But if it's all good, it will be pushed to dev int, will be then integrated with all the code. This will be a dev pro sandbox, and this is where we can do a smoke test of the build and any regression testing. And then once it's ready, we can push it to QA. We can have this be an automated process through a release manager will be overseeing this. This is more for the development and code process. So as I mentioned, we can use Flowsum for metadata migration as well. So in QA, we can set up some Selenium tests for functional testing. The manual test scripts will be done by QA, and more regression testing. Also, then we'll want to go to UAT after that, where there'll be user acceptance testing, also testing by the business, and then functional testing, again, using Selenium. This will be a partial sandbox, and then once it's ready, we'll push it to a full sandbox where we're going to do end-to-end integration testing. We could do load render testing for performance. We'll have to submit a case with Salesforce a couple weeks before we plan to do that to let them know and set up more Selenium functional tests there. And then once we push everything to production, we'll want to do some smoke tests. We can also set up a partial sandbox for user training where we can use things such as My Trailhead, and they can learn about the new functionality that we're developing before it's ready for release. We can create this partial from our UAT partial sandbox. And then we have a hotfix branch, which will be Dev Pro. So we have a different branch off of master. Whenever we see any critical issues, we'll have to define these timelines, since it mentions they do have some pretty strict schedules for severity 1 and severity 2 fixes. And also, because the CIO wants to standardize global processes, having this DevOps process will help us standardize on things such as code quality and process. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, the US drives a big part of the revenue stream. So the US is really pressuring them to be the first region to roll out first. And I do agree with this. And we'd have to help them understand that our regional based rollout is going to be the most beneficial and the lowest risk. So we would take a phased MVP approach by region. And since the US is has the biggest revenue stream, we'll have the biggest impact from them being rolled out first. So this is just something we're going to have to negotiate and work on with management. And I believe that's it. And I'm now willing to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Let's go.
Lilith.
Yeah, okay, guys. Okay, sure. So let's jump right into the processes to the tour operator management. The first one, we have there a mention of the round robin that I was wondering. You mentioned that you're going to implement this logic. Can you talk about how exactly will you implement this?
Oh, sure. So there's some sort of, we would have some sort of auto number field set up on the application. And then there's like a mod formula that we can use to determine who it would go to. So we'd have specific coordinators that would be assigned to a certain number. So based on the number that is in our formula field, the assignment would be based off of that in the assignment role, or the queue assignment.
Okay, so you would go for a build solution here. Did you consider anything else?
Yeah, there's some app exchange apps that can help us. I think I haven't worked with them, but I know of something such as Ringlead. I don't know if it works with custom.
So, and the decision not to go with them is based on?
I know it's not that difficult to implement, but so that was my decision, that it's pretty simple to implement it.
Well, what if you have to, what if it is not that easy to implement? Maybe you have to take into account holidays or other elements.
That's true. Yep. So if it is going to be something that's, and there could be a lot of different tour coordinators as well. So yeah, it would probably be beneficial to look at an app exchange app to help with that.
Okay, so you're changing the solution to an app exchange app, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Then I'm going to move over to my fellow judges. I see Chris, you ready?
Yeah, sure. Melissa, question. Can we look at the data model, please?
Sure.
Thank you. So first requirement here, we have the tour operators who need to register. Which object are you using to record the registration?
Oh, the registration is through the application. So they'll be filling out their information, and then when they're verified and approved, then there's a custom conversion process that creates the account and contact for the operators.
All right. How about some standard object for this one?
I could use lead, but I just didn't feel that it was justified, since it wasn't really like a typical lead conversion process. But I did consider it.
If you have lead, you can always customize the conversion yourself.
Yep, you can have a custom conversion.
And if you have lead, maybe the way you record the registration, you could also use something out of the box?
For the out of the box lead conversion.
I mean, let's say the form, the way you here you have a visual flow.
Yep.
But
So,
if you use lead, maybe you have something out of the box also.
Yeah, web to lead form. It did mention that there needs to be documentation. It wasn't clear if that needed to be collected up front or after the application was submitted. So if it needed to be submitted at the same time, web to lead wouldn't support that.
Web to lead would support documentation to be sent with the application, you say?
Yeah, it mentions that there's documents that need to be sent.
Does web to lead support attachments?
Upload for what?
For documentation, like attachment for web to lead form. Do you have this option?
No, that's why I said a web to lead form wouldn't support that. So that's why if it needs to be submitted at the time of the registration, we wouldn't be able to use web to lead.
Okay, can I follow up on this? Yeah. So in your tour operator management registration process, you have then the request to include that documentation at some point that is less than 10 MBs in size.
Yep.
If you go with the assumption that you are not going to include it during the registration, but doing that afterwards, how do you allow that for the applicants to do?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So if it's after, but they're not onboarded to the community yet, we'd have to have them either email it or upload it. And yeah, I don't know if they could upload it as a guest user with some identifier. I'm not sure about that. So email is an option. And then we can even implement email services to strip the attachments off and associate them with the application.
So what is your final solution? So I'm stressing that we assume that they will upload their documents after the application is created in the system.
I would have them email and we'd write an email service.
How do you match them to the email? So what should be then created during the application?
The record ID. So if they sent an email from the record, we can include the record ID so that when they respond back, they can attach the documents and we'll have the record ID, which the email service would use to know which record to associate the files to.
Where do you store the email information, on which object?
The email message, I believe.
No, I mean, in your application, where do you store the email information? Do you store it on application object?
Oh, right. Yes, everything's happening on the application.
And at which point you convert the application if it's successful in your flow?
Yep. So they have to go on site and then let's see. So upon review, this is after they're on site, they'll approve or cancel the registration. So when they approve, that's when they will go through the process. So it says here, once approved, the TOC then onboards the tour operator. So there'll be a custom conversion to create the account and contact, and then also the user for experience site access, and then they'll receive the email to where to log in for the experience site. And then they'll also have to set their password with Okta.
And if it's getting to be rejected, you will not store this applications as contact or lead.
Right.
You will not do that.
No.
What is the reason for not doing that?
Because I don't see any reason to have the account or contact created if they're not going to be approved as tour operators.
If they apply in a year, how do you find the information from the past application?
We would have to match on some criteria on past applications. So yeah, they could be some sort of window where they apply after a year, and then we just have to have a process for them to see if there's an existing application given the information, maybe a tax ID number or something.
The process being like you have the flow, Apex. What is your solution for recurring applications?
I mean, this is something that could be just manual if they do a search, or we could create a flow to make it more automated since they're trying to automate more processes.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah, let's go to the accessibility requirements, please.
Sure.
Yeah, so here there is a particular requirement where we are seeing that the we have a difference between the high risk versus the regional information. So it's not numbered, so I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, I see. AS can view all tour operator registration requests,
Yeah.
except for those that are noted high risk. Yep.
Yeah, so and here you mentioned that in order to make sure that you can see everything within your region, you're using the owner-based sharing for regional role. And then in order to open up access to the high risk, you would use criteria-based sharing. Now, my question is, how do you make sure with your owner-based sharing that you're actually not only are already showing the high risk records as well?
Sure. So the application is going to have a high risk, will have like a high risk flag on it. I made the assumption here that an AS would not own any of the high risk. So as they come in, they would get assigned to the a queue first for the high risk adventure specialist, and then one of those will take ownership of that record. So only the regular ones will be owned and shared. Because
but I can see there that some AS can be trained to manage these high risks. So an AS can actually be an owner, and they might be in a region. So if you then use owner-based sharing,
oh right,
everyone
so
else can see it too.
Yeah, if they're in the same role, we'd probably want to have a separate role for them.
Okay. All right. And then I see also in the accessibility that we have a particular requirement with regard to, I believe, Service Pro, where you mentioned that in order to facilitate the seamless transition, you would use Salesforce as the IDP. Now, if we go to your system landscape, didn't you introduce Okta as the IDP for internal users?
Yes, so we can actually have two different IDPs, so it would be kind of like an IDP chaining. So that's just to make sure that the users of Salesforce can seamlessly log in. But Okta can be our Okta can be our central IDP for both systems. So suppose they're logging into Service Pro just by itself, it would go through Okta. But if they're logging into Salesforce and then Service Pro, Salesforce can act as the IDP, and then it will detect that there's already a session with Okta and then log them into Service Pro. So that's how we would make sure the users are synced between systems seamlessly, or they're logging in between systems seamlessly.
So Okta would be actually your underlying IDP for both, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, okay. Thanks for clarifying. Well, I have some other questions with regard to data migration. If you could go to that particular slide as well.
Sure.
Great, thank you. So here I see that you mentioned that you're going to dedupe the information. So can you walk me through how this process would happen?
Sure. So we probably would want to use a tool. So if we're using something such as Informatica as our ETL, we could use Informatica data quality. So we'd bring all the data first into a staging database, and then we could set up rules for doing the matching. So we'd want to determine those rules with our data architects, the best way to match all this data. So it would all be raw data in the staging database, and then using our tool will run the data through those rules to figure out where the matches are, and then also work with data stewards to look at the data and try to figure out, is this actually a match, or is it not a match? So then those records could be merged into one. And then we'd have to maybe flag those. I believe we'd have to flag the records that we do want to bring in as matched records, and then we'd have to flag some data not to bring in. So then we want to bring it into the canonical database. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I do have a follow-up on this as well. So you mentioned that you're going to work with an MVP, right?
Yes.
So how does this impact your data migration?
So we would have, I want to do an initial data load, even though it's an MVP, and then smaller delta loads as we get closer to the release timeline, mostly because we do have other dates to be cognizant of, and we have to stick to certain deadlines and release dates. So if we don't hit our go live date because we run into data issues, then that could be a risk. So that's why I felt that doing an initial data load as early as possible with subsequent delta loads would be the lowest risk to project timeline.
Okay. And then with regard also to the MVP, I see that you're introducing also mobile publishers is going to be in scope of the MVP in that case.
Yeah, so some considerations there that we have to submit the app to the App Store for testing. So we'd want to do that as early as possible. And then get the beta testing link from Salesforce. So we have to submit that request to Salesforce.
Okay, and I don't know, did you mention how much time as a buffer we should foresee here, more or less?
I would say we'd probably want about 2 to 3 weeks. I should have indicated that.
Okay.
I felt that it was a faster time to market than a custom app.
Okay, yeah, moving on to Chris.
All right, Melissa, let's take a quick look at the governance. Can you scroll down? There is a requirement here mentioning US drives, a big revenue, etc. Yeah, this one. I wanted to know.
Did you highlight that for me? I really appreciate that.
Did I?
Yes, you did.
You could see that I was about to ask.
No,
right?
keep it highlighted. That's actually a great idea. If the judges could do that, that makes it easier.
Good. So I wanted to know here, how do you manage when you have this situation in terms of governance, when there is a manager, obviously from a powerful region, right, who is putting pressure maybe at one point on your release management to release a feature, but it is out of what was planned before. What's the governance and how do you take the decision? Who takes the decision behind?
So that would be something that would have to be reviewed by our change review board as well as our architecture review board to determine the feasibility of the of what's being requested, to see if it really is one, if it's a critical item and if it's high priority, if it will fit into the timeline, and if it will present any risk to the project. If it's not, then we can push back and say that this is something we can put on our to-do list for any subsequent phases, since we do want this to be an MVP approach so that we have the highest probability of success for the project.
And who do you see in your organization to take the final decision at one point, to be able to face this US regional manager and say, no, that will happen like this?
I would say it would be the program owner that would want to communicate that, because it's ultimately their program that they're overseeing and they're the ones that would be taking on that risk.
All right. Okay, thank you. Let's take a quick look at the support processes, please. Yeah. Yeah, this one. Below, I mean, at the bottom of your page, there is a question about if more than 10 occurs in a given year, the risk level of the operator is upgraded. In what you propose here, I see this is mainly something that's real time, right? That will happen.
Yeah.
How would you manage? I mean, what might be the load here behind the scene, and is it fair to have this real time? Do you need to be prepared for a high load? How would you handle that?
This is for the calculating the number of assistance requests that are the fault of the tour operator.
Yeah.
There's 500 tour operators, so I wouldn't imagine there being a high number.
Yeah, there is 500, but in terms of
so we're going to have to, we're going to have to track this using dates as well, because they could be downgraded. So it's going to have to be per year. So we could use batch Apex to do this work. Scheduled batch Apex.
So how would you, in terms of orchestration here, Can you just walk us through what comes first and what do you trigger last compared to what you already wrote?
So it wouldn't be happening immediately. It would maybe be a daily basis where the job will check to see what cases within a certain time frame is actually would be a better option. It will check to see, we'll run it daily, batch Apex job to be scheduled daily to see what cases are flagged as tour operator fault, and then see if it will query on certain dates, and if it fits within those dates, it will update that number. Also, this number we'll have to get a total actually, so we'll just be updating that number with the total. Or you could even do it on a weekly basis. And it doesn't seem like it needs to be that immediate. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. What about if you do it maybe when the assistant request is created? You check and you update the status.
So when the case is created, such as having a trigger or record trigger flow to check.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could do that.
So which approach would you choose between?
I would honestly just push it as a batch job, maybe run it weekly. It doesn't seem like it needs to be anything that's super critical, or just daily. I would say daily. At the end of the day, when all cases are submitted, that way it can calculate the total number each day and determine the risk level.
All right. Good for me. Cesar?
Thank you. So running on that discussion of the data complexity, you have a requirement in the first section, which is the tour operator management, to estimate the score for application. What is your solution for that?
Let's see. The registration score. So,
Yes.
In order to automate this. So I'm proposing that we use a visual flow to do the custom logic to determine. So we might have some. We would have to have some reference data, which we can store in a custom metadata type. Visual flow could call it invocable Apex to run that logic to determine what their score would be based on the criteria, such as the size of revenue, level of tours, and number of injuries and fatalities.
So I wonder if we don't store the application as an account, we need to access the risk level of tours. So we probably need to have them as tour drafts before we can assess the risk level. So how do you, or where do you get this data? What is the risk level of different tours of that application?
Yeah, so we'd want to, that's something that we can probably store as custom metadata. So we'd have a custom metadata type to have different types of tours and the different risk levels associated with them. So when they're applying to operate certain types of tours, we can associate a risk level with that specific tour. So we could have a lookup into the custom metadata type for the different types of tours, and then the tour operator coordinator would select which types of tours it is to determine those risk levels.
I see, but we still don't have that conversion yet, because that will happen only after we get on site and approve it.
Yes, these aren't tours that are actually set up yet. They're just communicating what kind of tours they would like to operate. So this would just be more like reference data for doing the scoring.
Okay, and where do you store that reference tours? If I need to create it as part of my registration, will it be part of the visual flow to create the registration, or how do I get this information into the system as an outsider without a registration yet in Salesforce?
So I wouldn't. So it's the TOC verifying and going through this visual flow, and I'm assuming they're talking to them maybe on the phone, and they're asking them the questions. What kind of tours do you want to set up, such as like a jungle tour or a city tour. And so these are different tours that will already have pre-assigned risk levels by global adventure tours. So it's more like around being a questionnaire. So we can store those in a custom metadata type and display them as part of the visual flow.
Okay, now the risk level assertion, my question is, you want to do that through visual flow or through Apex, but if it gets really complex, at which point you would consider data scalability is at risk? If you can add additional factors that would flow into that risk assessment, where would you store this? Do you have
where would I store the data?
How would you how would you structure the process around that risk assessment to be flexible enough and scalable enough to be so the client can adjust it if necessary in the future?
You mean adjust the risk level on their own tours?
Not the risk level, but the score, the registration score.
You're saying like the tour operators, you want them to be able to adjust it?
No. The client. Let's say the jungle tour is high risk, but in the future, jungles will be less and less dense. It will be less of a risk. How do I make it without changing the Apex too often?
Oh, well, that's in the custom metadata type, which is easily changeable through admins. But we also could just set this data up in a custom object.
Have you considered Einstein lead scoring feature for this? I mean, what is your rationale against this feature?
I'm not using leads, so I am not certain if it would work on a custom object. I would have to look into
but
that.
Then you would have it out of the box. So
right. So if I was to use leads with Einstein lead scoring, that's a possibility, yes, that we don't have to develop this ourselves if it does get too complex.
Okay. Can I have another question before I jump out? You have the adventure specialist reviews the application on site using mobile device, and you propose Salesforce One mobile app.
Yep.
So if you don't have access to it, because I can imagine that tour operators might be in a place where you didn't have connection, what is your solution for that?
Yep, I went over that probably really quickly. My solution was that they would have to make sure they're caching their records before they go on site, because they could lose connectivity. That's one of the caveats of using the Salesforce One app, and that would be part of user training and communication as to how to use the app.
You need to train them on that. Okay. Thank you. What?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So in the second part, I think it is indeed in the tour scheduling, there is a part about the pricing. And I think there you mentioned that the pricing, rather than using products, you would use custom metadata type, right?
Yeah.
Can you walk me through the reasoning justification here?
Sure. Yep. So I, like I said, I considered using products and price books, but I didn't see any complex pricing here. It says that there's basically a fee per region. So I thought about the business model, and Global Adventure Tours is really more like a platform bringing these tour operators with the adventure seekers. So they're just charging a fee to make the connection between the two. They're not actually selling any complex products. And because of the way I do have the tour schedule set up in the tours, I thought that this would be harder to model using products and price books. And then we have to deal with sharing, and sharing on products is something that's, I believe it's in the very new release, but it's still limited what you can do. So I just felt that going custom was a better option.
Okay, but what if the person or the team that is managing the pricing is not, does not have access to the setup?
We could have that in a custom object as well instead.
Okay, so that way it would be open up for them.
Yep. So we could have another custom object here for registration fees or per region. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Then I had another question with regard to the adventurer support. So I believe that there, at some point, you're mentioning that you're going to use a field-based SLA.
Yes.
So can you justify this a bit more, especially taking into account that you have Service Cloud in your system, and
Yes.
that there might be other options there?
Such as entitlements. So I didn't see this as being something where we needed to bring in entitlements and actual milestones on cases, but we could. It is a little bit more complex to set up. I thought that it was something that could be easily addressed just using a field, since it's pretty basic, but we could consider setting up entitlements and milestones as well for the SLAs, which would then be additional objects in our object model.
So are you going in that route, or are you sticking with the field based on account?
If we want to be more scalable, especially for other regions that might have different SLAs, I would probably move towards trying to set up the entitlements up front.
Okay. Fair enough. And then for this integration, you also mentioned that you're assuming that near real time will be sufficient. Can you build on that a bit more? Why are you making this assumption? Why do you think that is a valid assumption to make?
I made that assumption because it didn't tell me there needed to be some sort of response for the user, immediate response. So it just says updates need to be integrated in real time. It didn't tell me it needed to be any kind of request reply pattern. So to alleviate any issues with request reply, I felt that we could take advantage of the streaming API and use platform events.
Okay. With regard to platform events, can you walk me through kind of like the error handling process, for example, you would set up there?
Sure. So the platform events come with a replay ID, which are good for 72 hours. So when we create the platform event, it will be published to a specific streaming API event channel, which the ESB is listening on. So if there are any issues, the ESB can come back in and get all the replay IDs to retrieve all the platform events that it possibly could have missed.
So how does the ESB know which platform events it had, and you know, which ones it may have missed, or what was the last one that they received? How are you tackling that part?
I believe it would have to keep track of the ID of the last one that it retrieved, and they're not guaranteed order, but they are in order, so it could go by the last number and then look for any of the newer ones after that.
Okay. In some rare cases, it might be that it's just not being published. How would you tackle such situations in this case?
So if the platform event's not getting published at all on the Salesforce side, we would have to build in some sort of error handling on the Salesforce side to deal with any issues. So we could build some error logging on the platform. We could log to maybe a custom error logging object. So when we publish that platform event, we'll know that it was published and we could record the time.
Okay, so you're logging the error, and is there a retry mechanism or anything? How will you recover that? How will it still be, executing the process?
On the Salesforce side, if we do see that there are any errors, I'll have to come back to you on that.
Yeah, fair enough. Moving on to Chris.
Thank you. Melissa, I had a couple of follow-up questions on what Lilith asked you. Can we stay on adventure support? So here for the response level and stuff, you said we would move to milestone and entitlements.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do we answer the requirement here with the reminded every 4 hours until they accept the case?
We would have to trigger off of a field that is not the created date for our milestone. So it would have to be some sort of custom date field. And then if the milestone gets triggered and it hasn't been accepted yet, we'd have to reset that so that it would then be fired again. And then once it's accepted, we could update it to as accepted so that it will only look for cases that have not been accepted or resolved.
So what platform feature would you use to automate that and to also to do the reminding part of the job?
We could use Record Trigger Flow for creating reminder tasks and for updating the date field.
All right, thank you. So can we take a look at the adventurer request section? All right, just here. So the bullet point number 4 here, we say that the system has to suggest tools to adventurers.
Yeah.
So first question, I'd like to understand what's the user experience behind this.
It would be some sort of logic we build in with Apex. That's the only thing I could really determine from that.
How I mean, the user experience from the user perspective, how does it, I mean, I'm an adventurer, I come on the website. How does this, how do you see this feature being put? How does it display? What does it consider?
Sure. So it could be a component that we put on the home page when the adventurers log in and say, these are your suggested tours based on logic that is built in the Apex. So it would be a Lightning Web Component, have an Apex controller that performs logic on their historical book tours so they can see this when they first log in. If they like any of the suggested tours, they can click a button to say book tour, and then that's when they'd create their order for that tour.
So you would hit the external object each time, or do you store the suggestions?
Oh, what the tours that are actually being suggested. Yeah, we could run the logic and store them in another custom object for suggested tours so that we don't have to keep doing that. But they will probably change as well. So we'd want to update it every time they book a tour. It would be based on logic from the current bookings.
So what would you take? Compute each time I come on the website, or keep something that I update from time to time?
For performance and any issues with OData callouts, it probably would be a better idea to store it, kind of cache it, and then update it maybe on a weekly basis. So we could use more of a batch job to do that, and perform that logic.
Okay. For the computation here, what do you imagine as an engine to do recommendation?
Oh God, I don't know. You expecting me to figure that logic out? I'm going to bring in my developers to do that.
Okay, let's admit then that this logic is a bit. Let's admit this logic is a bit complex then.
I'm going to ask the developers to code that for me, and along with the business to determine the rules for determining the logic. That we'll have the business and developers work together.
So my point would be, do we want this on the platform actually?
If it was something that was completely data intensive, we could just have that done on the AWS side, especially where it's maybe we're just going off the historical data that we're archiving. Since I mentioned we probably want to archive maybe 60 days after the tour is complete, we could build that on AWS. We could probably build, I think it's a Lambda function to do some of that logic, and then we could call that from Salesforce.
If ever you had to offload this off the platform, which data would you need for the Amazon part to do its job?
To do the logic. So I have order, tour schedule, and tour is being off platform. And then we have to know who actually booked the tour. So I have the lookup from order to account. So we'd probably, if we don't want to come back into Salesforce to figure out who it is, we'd have to also store the account record.
So how do you see the integration going? How do you keep this data in the external system? Do you send it when it's needed? How do you see it?
The account data.
The data you need.
So there's an archival process. So the data, so what we, if we do need the reference data such as accounts, we'd send that data over. I'd say we could just send it when we first archive their orders if it doesn't already exist.
So in that case, you would have only the archived order in this system. You also need the order that are not archived yet.
What was the last part again?
If I understand your answer, you said that as soon as you archive the data, you send it to the Amazon or whatever system, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So it means that this Amazon system only has the archived data. You will also need to provide the living data in the system.
Yes, such as the account. So we'd have to have some logic to determine if the account already exists over there, and if it doesn't, then we'll create the account as well for as reference data.
All right. So if you had to choose an architecture here between offloading the computation somewhere else or keeping everything on the platform, what would be your take?
So my determination will be based on how complex it is. If it is more of a complex computation, I would definitely move it off platform, especially where it's going to query the external data. But I'm not sure of the complexity. So if I make the assumption it's not that complex, we can just keep it off platform, since maybe, like I said, we would just run it on a scheduled basis.
All right, thank you. Last follow-up question for me for now. Talking about the accessibility, can we scroll to accessibility, please? Yeah. It's a follow-up from one of Edith's questions. Can you please walk me through again on the bullet point number 3, where we say that the service coordinators, they need to use Salesforce credentials to log into Service Pro.
Yeah.
So what happens if these service coordinators, they access Service Pro, they access Salesforce, but at one point in time, they need to access another system that is protected by Okta? Yeah. Do they have to log in again?
If they're already logged into Okta, no, they would not have to log in again, as long as they're set up in that system for single sign-on.
Okay, but here the requirement is Salesforce as ADP. The requirement was to use Salesforce service credentials in the system. Yeah, the requirement here is to use Salesforce credentials. Yep. For Service Pro, right?
Yep.
So if I use Salesforce credential and if Salesforce is my IDP, I have not opened the session in Okta.
Right. It would be between Salesforce and Service Pro.
Yeah.
It would be IDP initiated if they start from Salesforce, and maybe we can even set up a connected app that supports SAML for them to log into Service Pro from Salesforce.
Exactly. So now if I click on a link to go to another system, my session is in Salesforce, but it was never created in Okta.
Right.
So how do I keep the SSO in that case?
So they would be prompted to log into Okta if they're not logged in already.
Okay, so they would log in again. They would log in Okta afterwards. All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Any idea you have to channel the SSO to Okta? Do you think of anything?
You can chain. You can do chaining. Yep. So we could chain it so that if they are also in Okta, it would go to detect that session.
And because here we believe the Salesforce credentials are different from the Okta credentials. So if you have to change the IDP, What's the, let's say, the security concept you would use to tell Okta, please open a session for this person?
So if they try to log into Service Pro from Salesforce, and then it needs to go from Salesforce to Okta. What
Yeah.
you're asking what we would use there?
I just wanted to make sure the SSO can be kept for these service coordinators without them to have to log again on Okta. It was a...
The user session and user context would be stored at the browser level. Does that answer your question?
My question was about can I open a session, because you mentioned IDP chaining. So
Yep.
Then I was wondering what does it mean behind the scene? Because I understand that once you have opened a session at Salesforce, now you need to open a session in Okta. How do you do it seamlessly, or do you really have to ask for the credentials?
I believe we could use IDP chaining, but I would have to look into that implementation a little bit further to answer your question.
Great. Thank you, Melissa.
If you don't mind, I will ask my last question.
Sure.
Candidate Melissa. So I have a question to your strategy. So you're going with single org strategy.
Yeah.
And your reason to do that is that we have faster time to market.
Mm-hmm.
Are you sure that we have faster time to market if you are going to consolidate all the orgs into single org rather than just keeping them on the regional level?
So the faster time to market here is based on in one of the orgs already having very similar process and configuration to what we want to build. If we didn't use an existing org, then we'd have to bring in a new one, which would require new development configuration. Are you asking, whereas we're just going to keep them separate and then just use one org as our main org? That would actually be, that would be more complex integration, but that would not adhere to the project desire to standardize their processes. It would make it harder to do that.
Okay, so to that, which org are you going to take as a main, as the org that will be the role model for all other orgs?
So the surviving org, we're going to go through a process of determining which org is most similar to the future state that we're trying to define. And
Okay,
has
but,
the post that we can reuse.
So you will define that, but your proposal is to build an MVP for USA.
Yep.
What if US will not be the org that you will be surviving org? Or what if US doesn't have a Salesforce at all at this point? What is your course of action?
The course of action is determine what region does have an org that we can build in for
Yes.
the US. So it will be regionalized specifically for the United States.
So what makes you think that the other region would be suitable to regionalize for US?
Because
If
the assumption is we can find some similar business processes and configuration that could support the processes we want to implement for the United States.
Okay, but you have the statement that US have been pulling the resources onto them in the past, which is historic fact. So, and you propose to build now for US again. What is the mechanism you put in place to make sure that the requirement that US will be asking for will be suitable for the rest of the landscape?
That would go through our governance and change management.
Yes, the governance and change management can be also influenced by US because it's the main revenue generator. So
yes.
What is the mechanism to make sure that it will be fair to the other orgs?
We do want to have representatives as part of the steering committee from all the different regions.
Right, but so again, but US has a big power. So how do you make sure that you leverage everyone else, like democratize the process? If you want to go with a single org,
Yeah,
that's my question.
I feel some discrimination against the US here. I'm just kidding. So can you restate your question, please?
So it isn't your risk, right? The risk that you have is that US is going to bring up the escalation friction and being priority. Now you give them the MVP for US to support the frictions and escalations.
Yeah.
Now my question is, what is the mechanism? How do you leverage that US will not build the solution for themselves only, which was happening in the past?
This is oversight by all of the governance. So that's why we're going to set up a governance body to oversee the work being done, so that they won't just say everything's going to be specific for them, but we want to make sure we're building whatever we're building is reusable and not just too specific for one region. We will have a lot of shared functionality between regions, so that we want to make sure we're adhering to standards and reusability, which will be defined by our architecture review board.
And what did happen to the existing orgs while you will build the MVP for US? Will you keep them as they are, or you will upgrade them onto the new processes in parallel?
So we could take an approach where we're building first and then bringing those other orgs in a subsequent phase. So my suggestion for consolidating the orgs was due to the desire to standardize their global processes.
So your approach will be to build first and then bring, or you will upgrade them as you go?
I would say upgrade as we go. So we're going to be implementing for the US first, and then upgrading the other regions, bringing them into the org.
So when do you foresee a switch to single org then?
It would be a phased approach. So it would probably be more of a maybe a phase 2, phase 3 to bring the other orgs in.
Does it mean that you will build the integrations for multiple orgs first?
So the other orgs are really, it mentions that they're being used. Let's go back to what they're being used for. They're being used more for the almost like I felt like it was more of like a contact database for the tour operators. So we want the adventure seekers to be logging in and booking their tours in this new org, not the new org, but the org that we're customizing to facilitate that. So my assumption here is that it's just to manage their interactions with tour operators. It didn't tell me that a whole lot was happening in those orgs. So they could still be doing that, and then we go through a data migration process once we're ready and we feel that the functionalities where we want it to be, to bring those other regions on.
All right, let's leave it at this. Already 6 minutes over, I believe. So